and there's a bunch of alligators or crocodiles or something, some type of animals that are going to eat him and the kids. There's a 50-gallon drum and a cover for the drum in this room, which is 20 or 30 feet in diameter or something like that. So he's immediately confronted with a problem. What does he do? There's enough room in the drum for himself and one kid, or the two kids, but there's not enough room for all three. So he immediately grabbed up the kids and put the cover on the lid and turned to face this creature coming after him, presumably to do him ill harm. All of a sudden, all this scenery fades out, and he's standing there by himself, and it changes to another scene where he's sitting on a table, and he's underneath a sort of, I call it a hat, but it's more like a special duty helmet. It's got a U shape pointing downwards, like a horseshoe pointing downwards, from left ear to right ear, and then another one that's perpendicular from his forehead to the back of his head. So he's got 4 contact points on his head. He's sitting on a table in a room, and into the room walks one of the bigger creatures, and following along are a bunch of smaller creatures. The smaller creatures sit on another table across from Ed, and they have these hanging helmets hanging from the wall, hanging from the ceiling, and they put one of the helmets on each one of the little creatures, and Ed relives the scene. He relives the scene of being in this. He relives the scene of being in a room with a creature and a 50-gallon drum and a couple of kids and so on. He relives that right up through the ending of it when he makes his decision and makes a decision to save the 2 kids, and that ends the scenery. So it was like he was in a play, you might say, which was tape recorded or video recorded, and then it's replayed while these little creatures presumably see what's going on. And associated with these events, there were several different types of test sequences that Ed underwent. This is all written up in his books. One of the first messages he got by writing in the middle of the night was, "The news must learn." Now you think of that, when the investigators saw this, the news must learn, the first thing you think of is news. We typically call the news the newspaper type of news. It didn't make any sense. The news must learn. After he had undergone hypnotism and a number of these situations where it appeared that he was acting as undergoing an experience and reacting in a certain way, and then these creatures learning what this reaction was somehow, it made sense then. The news must learn. If you replace news with new ones, the new ones must learn. The babies, the children must learn. It's as if he was a school teacher, and these kids were coming to school, and he was teaching by acting out various situations that human beings might be confronted with. That's a very interesting. It was largely ignored because everybody thought Ed was a big hoaxer, but it wasn't a hoax. It was all the real stuff. Very complicated, intricate, produced lots of pictures, and lots of other witnesses. Although he was the only one to produce lots of pictures, other people did produce some pictures, and they had a couple of hundred other witnesses to things flying through the sky.
Interesting. Now, James, do you got another question at all for Bruce?
Yeah. Those just a couple of quick ones. The Ed Walters. Have you ever did an in-depth study on those pictures to determine, were they real? Could they be plausible? And
they were raked over the coals by all sorts of people.
Yeah.
Not just me. And I found evidence in the pictures which, well, one of the things that Ed was accused of was doing double exposures, where a typical double exposure might be you set up a model UFO in a dark room with a black background, and you should light it somehow or other without lighting the background, so that you can make a picture of this object. Let's say in the middle of the picture that you're going to take. He had an old Polaroid camera that you could click the shutter. Each shutter click corresponds to an exposure. He could have as many exposures as he wanted before pulling the film out. The old Polaroid types, way back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, the old Polaroid types, you had to take the picture, then you pulled out a tab that combined the what would be the negative with a developer, a very clever system. The negative and the developer would develop in 60 seconds to form a picture. And so you could click the shutter any number of times before you pulled the tab and started the exposure, started the development of the picture. So it was logical, everybody thought, that he was doing double exposures. Well, I found pictures that he took which could not possibly have been double exposures. The double exposure had a certain Achilles heel, you might say, that allows you to figure out that it was a double exposure, not a single exposure. Anyway, the pictures were looked at by professionals all over the place, including the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and several government laboratories and stuff like that. And they're pretty complicated, but they stand on their own. And there was an awful lot of stuff besides the pictures that everybody saw in his first book, The Gulf Breeze Sightings. It was published in 1990. He published a couple more books, Abductions in Gulf Breeze, and UFOs Are Real, Here's the Proof. And UFOs Are Real, Here's the Proof. I was a co-author of that. And I discussed a number of the pictures that people had said were fakes, and I showed they weren't. Also, that book has a number of cases. Once Ed became well known, literally throughout the world, Gulf Breeze was a UFO central for several years. People from other countries and other locations would send him copies of their pictures, a number of them which looked just like what Ed had. So it wasn't just him seeing these things.
Interesting. Oh, thank you. Also, I got a question for you. Also, Bruce, in your opinion, what's another plausible explanation for people if they're not being abducted? What would be another plausible explanation that they would think this?
They're not being abducted, but they think they are?
Well, if they're not being abducted, what would be another explanation? Yeah, if they think they are.
Well, I suppose you could imagine a dream state that seems to be so convincing you think something has happened. Most of the people who we know have been abducted are primarily those who have realized it themselves and come forward. More are coming forward, I presume, nowadays. We're more receptive to UFO stuff nowadays than we were 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. Well, when this whole abduction stuff started in the late 50s with a case in Brazil. I can't think of the guy's name off the top of my head now, but then there was Betty and Barney Hill in '62, and their story being told in a book that was published in '65, I think. The Interrupted Journey. And then in the 70s, more and more people were claiming weird abduction stuff, and that's when Bud Hopkins got interested and started investigating sightings and abductions that occurred right across the East River from where he lived in New York City. And he had, I don't know, a dozen people or something were featured in his first book, Missing Time. After that, this sort of began a an explosion, you might say, over the 1980s and 90s. And David Jacobs wrote a couple of books on the subject, all of which basically assume that this was actually happening, and what does it mean if it's real.
That's the whole point. I mean, the people are now, I think because of the news media, with the Navy, with the Army coming out what they have, people are starting to come out more. I get a lot of people, Bruce, emailing me on a daily basis saying that they were abducted or they've seen UFOs. For some reason, through all the years I've been in broadcasting, around September, reports of abductions and UFOs would drop way off. It hasn't done it this year. And do you think it's because maybe the news media has been a little bit more warmer towards UFOs than ever before? You got the cable channels, with shows about, UFOs and abductions and all this stuff. So I think people, at least my opinion, I think people are warming up to maybe something like this does exist, and people now are willing to share their experiences.
Right. I think that's probably correct, that the resistance to such an idea has been dropping. 30 years ago, somebody who mentioned anything like that would be shunned by society, I guess. Called an idiot or something like that, or just laughed off. And in that situation, abductees would look for or hope to find somebody who would be willing to listen to them tell their story without putting a bag over their head.
Yeah. Well, you hit it right on the nail, because, I started broadcasting back in 1976. Didn't really get into UFO subjects to the early 80s. And then, it's funny. A lot of people, would say things like they would tell their friends at work, I saw a UFO. And they said all of a sudden their friends at work weren't friends with them anymore. They kind of distant themselves from them because they thought, oh, this guy is strange. Now you got people in law enforcement, military, pilots, all kinds of lawyers, doctors, all claiming that they've seen UFOs or they've been abducted, and they're not quite as scared to share it.
Yeah, abductions are still the point of the spear, you might say. But having ordinary, non-threatening sightings is becoming extremely popular, shall we say. There are certainly a lot of sightings or sighting reports every week all over the world. Now, a lot of these reports, of course, are misidentifications. I continually get photos, or somebody would say I was photographing that scenery, a mountain, I was photographing my kids, I was photographing something over there. And after I saw the photo, I noticed this image in the sky or up above or somewhere on a picture, an image that I didn't remember seeing when I took the picture. It was a UFO. And so I'm asked to sort of identify or confirm the person's belief that it could be a UFO. In most cases like that, these sightings of objects up in the sky can be explained typically by birds or insects or something, depending on how far away you think this object was from the camera, the lighting, the conditions of the photo, and so on. Rarely do you find a situation where this accidental UFO turns out to be could turn out to be real. I myself am mostly interested in the cases that if the person sees the object and then takes a picture of it, that's the logical situation, and the person would have presumably some built-in filtering in their brain as to filter out all your real things. You look up and you're going to take a picture and you see an object up there in the sky and you immediately recognize it's a bird. You take the picture and sure enough it shows a bird. You're not going to send it to me and ask me if it's a UFO.